Thanks. Cool. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. They always start off as quiet pints at the pub, but they get progressively louder. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about GulpJS. As said, I run the JavaScript Playground blog, a blog where I should write more often, but I kind of write a bunch of stuff about JavaScript. You can find me on Twitter as Jack_Franklin, and from there you'll get links to all my sites and everything I've done. I work at a company called Cardless, who are a kind of startup about 3 years old now, based in London, just up the road in Angel. We are hiring. If anyone is looking to come and write lots of Ruby, let me know. Cool. So day to day in the workflow of a kind of front-end developer, we do loads of things over and over and over again. And things just like pre-optimizing images, the obvious one, concatenating and minifying a bunch of code into one file to push to production. Images, running tests, running JS hint, JS lint, all these kind of things. There's a bunch of tasks that we have to do repetitively over and over again. And now developers, or at least me, we're really lazy. And being lazy as a developer, I think, is a good trait. And we very quickly decided that we shouldn't do this stuff over and over again. We could get computers to do this stuff over and over again. Computers are really good at these kind of repetitive tasks. So we started to come up with these build tools. One of the most oldest is Make, which comes on Unix. There's ones for Ruby, like Rake. And there's a bunch for pretty much every language out there. But as we all know, JavaScript is the most superior language. That's just a fact. We're not going to discuss that any further, and no one is going to tweet me otherwise. And once we realized that we had JavaScript, the best language in the world, we could write these build tools in JavaScript. In particular, the kind of growth of Node.js, which kind of brought JavaScript to the server, also brought us the ability to run JavaScript really easily on the command line. From here, tools like Grunt emerged. If anyone happened to be here last year, I did a talk on Grunt. And after Grunt came along, Grunt's a fantastic tool, we got another one, the one I'm going to talk about today, called Gulp. And now this isn't a Grunt v Gulp talk at all. This is just an introduction to Gulp. I will talk briefly about Grunt later. So Gulp claims to be the streaming build system, and it really embraces the idea of streams, which are a kind of abstract in-memory version of a file in Node. Effectively, these build tools, what they're doing is they're performing lots of transformations over a set of files. So files get picked up, they go through a series of steps, and they get outputs again at the other end. The inefficient way to do this is to kind of pull that file off the disk every time and give it to each individual transform. So you can kind of look at this diagram as taking a file, performing one transform on it, maybe concatenating, then kind of writing it back to disk. The next transform that might, I don't know, remove comments or do whatever it might do, has to then pick that file off the disk again, and so on and so forth. Now on a big project, when you get larger projects, this becomes quite inefficient quite quickly. You're kind of writing to and from the disk a lot. And it's also weirdly complex because after transform one, the transform one has to write the file somewhere, but where does it write it? Does it write a temporary file for the next transform? Does it write it back to where it came from? There's kind of a lot of complexity there. However, Gulp kind of takes a different approach. By embracing these streams, which is like the contents of a file in memory, what you can do is you can load the files off the disk at the beginning. You can then pass this stream, which represents the files, through a series of transforms, where those transforms edit the content of the file only in memory. And then right at the end, once you're done, you can write them back to disk. This becomes much more efficient. You don't have to deal with the complexity of temporary files, writing any of that to disk. And it means every plugin can take a stream and give a stream out. And in between, it can do whatever it wants to the files. And this basically is a diagram of what a typical Gulp task looks like. But just before we get into Gulp, I want to talk a little about streams generally. Dominic Tarr wrote this kind of gist, which is his kind of Node style guide. And this quote in particular is really good. Streams in Node, on the rare occasions when doing something the fast way, is actually easier, so use them. The bolding and the capitals was me. But streams they're really, really nice in Node, and they're kind of underused in my opinion. But I really would, if you're writing any Node generally, there are loads of use cases for streams beyond Gulp that I would recommend having a look into. In particular, there's this stream handbook on GitHub, which kind of takes you from the very beginning through to the end. Really, really useful. The slides also will be online after the talk, so don't worry about writing URLs down too much. So a typical thing we might do in Node is request the contents of a URL. And without streams, we would probably do this like this. We take the URL, we give it a callback function that is called when that URL, the data from it is received, and then we write the file, and then there's another callback that is called when that file is written to disk. There's plenty of problems with this. If the request fails halfway through, we're not going to get any data. If the writing file fails, the file won't be written at all. If we suddenly get back a very large amount of data from that URL, there might just not be enough memory to deal with it, because we have to have all the data from that URL in memory to then write it all to the file. However, with streams, we can do it more like this. What we can do is we can grab that URL, and we can pipe it through. So we can basically push it through this pipe to a write stream, which is going to write the contents to disk. And in this case, it will write it to a file called out. What's important to know about this is this will write the data as it comes in from the URL, not all at the end. This makes it much quicker. It can deal with files of arbitrary size, because it doesn't ever have to have the entire file in memory. And it's also more, it can deal with errors better. So if it errors halfway through, you're still going to get some of the data. There's plenty of callbacks, like on end and others, so you can kind of hook onto particular events. And that's really what Gulp embraces. Gulp also provides kind of an abstraction layer up above streams, so you never really have to deal with streams directly in Gulp. But I really would recommend checking them out if you're doing much Node. Cool. So back to Gulp. So Gulp is a command line build tool. You run it on the command line, and the first thing to do, obviously, is to install it. So using the Node package manager, you install it globally with the --global flag, and that will give you the Gulp command line executable. You then go into your new project, and you're going to run npm init, which is going to generate this package.json for you. This contains information about your project, like the name, the version, that kind of thing, but more importantly, the dependencies of your project. And I'll come back to those in a second. Once you've done that, a bit confusingly, you need to install Gulp locally as well to your project. So you can install Gulp with npm install Gulp. This time we're not using the global flag because we want to install it locally. We can use the --save--dev flag. What that does is it inserts Gulp into your package.json as a dev dependency. This means we can use npm to manage all our dependencies. And it means if I clone your project and kind of get it on my machine, I run npm install, and it's going to go and install Gulp for me and make sure those dependencies are dealt with. So I'd really recommend getting into the habit of doing --save--dev kind of all the time when you're kind of installing tools that are helping you with your development workflow. There's also just --save if you're installing things that your project depends on, that your end users of the project are going to need to depend on. And after we've done that, we need to create a Gulp file. It's kind of convention for build tools for the files to be named after the tool. So for example, make, expect a make file, grunt, a grunt file, rake, a rake file, and Gulp, a Gulp file. It can be capital or lowercase g in the Gulp file, but convention, again, seems to leave us with capitals. The first thing we do here is just require Gulp, just using Node's kind of module system. We require Gulp. And then we define a task. And this really is, I could stop here and you'd all have a pretty good idea of what Gulp was. Basically lets you define tasks, which are functions that we then invoke. Here we define the default task, and all I'm asking it to do is log out hello. You can see that there. So now, because I've named this task default, this is the task that Gulp will run if you don't tell it which task to run. So now I can go into the command line of my project, and I can run Gulp, and it's just going to load in the Gulp file and go through, and you can see there midway it logs out hello onto the screen. And that's it, I'm done. You know Gulp. At the core, that's all Gulp is. It's basically functions in JavaScript that you attach a name to so you can then call from the command line. That's pretty much what's going on. Thankfully, it does offer a lot more as well, but at the core, it's just JavaScript functions. And it's really important to remember that it is just JavaScript. I don't want to spend the entire talk comparing it to Grunt, and I'm not saying this is necessarily better or worse, but if you've written a lot of Grunt files, you'll know that you spend most of your time configuring plugins. You kind of have that big init config with the big object, and you put in your configuration for the plugins. In Gulp, the standard is more just to write the code rather than configuring some plugin. It tends to mean Gulp plugins are smaller and do less because you have to do more of it yourself. And we can also define tasks that have a name. So here I've defined a task called foo, and it's going to log out a foo task. And I just invoke that by running Gulp foo. And all that's really happening here is Gulp, when I run Gulp foo, Gulp is finding this task, and it's just calling that function. That's the core of Gulp. But of course, I don't know about you, but my build processes are a bit more complicated than logging out hello world. What we can use is we can use gulp.source. Gulp.source is what we use to grab files from the disk into streams that we can then process. So the Gulp plugin conventions are fairly strict. Most plugins expect streams. And Gulp source is your main kind of way of grabbing files and getting them into a stream. And we can use gulp.source like this, and we can pass in either an array or just a single string. This can match a particular file, or it can use kind of globbing patterns. So the first one will match all JavaScript files in the app/main directory. The second one matches all JavaScript files in the app directory, but at any level. So even if there was a JavaScript file 4 kind of directories down in app, it would find it. The third one just matches a single file. And the fourth one matches all JavaScript files and also all HBS files in the current directory. And you can kind of, there's lots of other things you can do with these globs, but typically star.js will probably be what most of yours look like. So let's take a look at how we might minify. This is probably one of the most common operations JavaScript developers have to do before pushing something live. And we can use the Gulp Uglify plugin to do this. So I would install it again through npm, and then we require it. So I say var uglifies require the Gulp Uglify plugin. Now I define this task called minify. The first thing I do is I use gulp.source to give it app.js. This is going to load in the app.js file into memory. I then pipe it through to the plugin Uglify. And you can think of the pipe as literally grabbing this app.js and just almost like prodding it through this long pipe full of your transforms. So it's just basically nudging app.js along, and it nudges it into the Uglify plugin, which takes it and then modifies it. In this case, the Uglify plugin will minify the JavaScript. I then pipe it again through to gulp.dest, which is the part of Gulp that's used for writing files back to disk. In this case, dest takes a folder name, which I've called out. So this is going to create out/app.js in my current directory that will be minified through Uglify. You can kind of think of this as a kind of, we use gulp.source to grab the file off the disk, we have this app.js, then we push it into this pipe where the only transform in the middle is Uglify, pushes it out, and then we use gulp.dest to write it back to disk. So a bit more about gulp.dest. Gulp.dest is what we use to write files to disk. Up until the point where you call gulp.dest, nothing will ever be written to disk. So a plugin like Uglify only edits the contents of the file in memory. It never will touch the disk at all. You have to very explicitly tell Gulp when you want to save files, which is really good. So this kind of pattern of sourcing something, piping it through a plugin, and then piping it through to gulp.dest, giving it a folder name, is really, really common, and the vast majority of Gulp tasks will look somewhat like this. Okay, so congratulations, you actually know Gulp now. That's pretty much it. I've said that before, and I'm not actually going to say it again. This pretty much is all there is to Gulp. You have plugins that work on streams, use gulp.source to pull files into those streams, use gulp.dest to write them back to disk. And I could stop now, and you would be able to go off and probably write quite a fair amount of JavaScript in your Gulp files to do most of your tasks. But unfortunately for you, I do have some more stuff to talk about. So let's have a look at a slightly more complex one. We're going to concatenate a bunch of files into one, and then we're going to minify that file. So I'm going to use the Gulp Concat and Gulp Uglify plugins. Gulp Concat does exactly what you imagine. It just takes a bunch of files, merges them into one. So I'm going to define a task called min again. The first thing I do is source something. This, all my JavaScript files in my application, whatever that might be. I then pipe it through into concat. Concat is slightly different in that it takes some arguments, some kind of configuration. And in concat's case, it takes in as an argument the name of the file you expect it to create. So gulp.source grabs all these files. We pass them into concat, which is going to merge them all into one file, which I've asked it to call app.js. And it's really important to note that concat here has not written app.js to disk. It's just created it in memory. I then pipe it into Uglify, just like we did before, and then gulp.dest with an empty string writes the current file to the current directory. So this is just going to create an app.js file in the current directory. Similarly, using my really nice diagrams that definitely aren't made up of the pre-made Keynote templates, you can imagine this as grabbing all the JavaScript files, pushing them through into concat, which pushes out just a single app.js file, which is pushed into Uglify. It's then pushed out into an app.js file, which gulp.dest then writes back to the disk. And because we're really, really lazy as developers, we didn't even want to call these kind of tasks manually because that's a lot of effort. And let's face it, 8 characters is quite a lot to type. And what we can do instead is we can watch, and we can watch files for changes and run tasks based on that. So imagine that I had the previous min task that I just had on slides a minute ago. I've just got rid of it just to get the room in. We can define another task called watch, and the name of the task here is entirely, it could be anything. Watch tends to be a sensible name. And we just use the inbuilt gulp.watch. What it does is it takes in a glob to match against files, and then an array of tasks to run when it detects a change in one of those files. So this is going to watch every single JavaScript file in my project, and when one of those changes, it's going to run the min task. And where I've got min there, it could be an array of multiple tasks. You could run lots of them. That brings me on quite nicely to task dependencies. So in Grunt, everything is very sequential. You run one plugin, you run the next one, and so on, and they run pretty much one after the other. To get them to run concurrently, you have to install an additional plugin. There's a Grunt concurrent plugin that will do that. In Gulp, however, they kind of take the opposite approach. And from the documentation on GitHub, all tasks run with maximum concurrency. So it's going to launch all the tasks at once and try and get them all done as soon as it possibly can. Effectively, you can think of it as concurrent by default. This is really tempting to try and fight, particularly if you're used to Grunt or other tools. But really, you really should not try and fight this. This is a good thing that Gulp is concurrent by default. If you think about it, how many tasks depend on the result of previous tasks? And the answer probably actually isn't that many. I've seen build processes that do things like optimize images, or maybe optimize them down into smaller file sizes. And then after they've done that, they will then go and minify the JavaScript because it's kind of one after the other. But there's no reason those can't be kicked off at the same time. And Gulp really takes that viewpoint that tasks will run as many of them as we can at once to get it done as quickly as possible. However, there are the odd occasion where you need to be able to run a task after another one. That does, unfortunately, crop up a fair few times. And this is possible in Gulp. I need to say Grunt then. This is possible in Gulp. It's a little complicated, and that's something that's going to change in Gulp 4, which I'll talk about in a bit. But effectively, all you have to do to make this possible is you have to make a task be able to tell the other tasks in your Gulp file when it's finished. And there are 2 main ways of doing this. The first, which is probably really common to anyone who's done any JavaScript, is that this task function takes in a callback function, and when that task is complete, it's expected to call the callback. You can pass in null if there wasn't an error, or you can pass in an error message, and Gulp will then kind of throw the error. And by doing this, what happens is external tasks can now know when this task has finished because it calls that callback, so it notifies them. The more and there's the callback. The more, if you like, Gulpish way of doing things is to instead return the actual stream. So this task also is able to tell other tasks it's finished. Because notice the return keyword, so we're actually returning gulp.source.pipe. The result of that is going to be a stream. And streams have an end event, which is basically when everything has kind of stopped processing. So if a task returns a stream, other tasks can watch that stream for the end event, and when that end event is triggered, they know that the task is finished. So by doing this, tasks are able to communicate that they've completed. Once you've done that, you can then tell a task that depends on another task. So here's my new task, task 3. And here, the kind of array with 2 in tells task 3 that it has to, when task 3 is called, it should trigger task 2 and wait for that to be completed before it then goes and does its own thing. You can also get a bit more complicated if you want, and you can tell task 3 that it relies on tasks 1 and 2. There's a little bit of a gotcha here, though, that tasks 1 and 2 won't run one after the other or in a particular order. They will run concurrently. So task 3 will be called once tasks 1 and 2 have completed, but you can't guarantee the order of tasks 1 and 2. If you needed to, you could have task 3 depend on task 2 and task 2 depend on task 1, and that would then guarantee the order. And this kind of thing, again, is something that's going to be revisited and reworked in Gulp 4, because a lot of people get tripped up by this, because it's a little confusing. But actually, this kind of way of doing things when you've got multiple tasks depending on each other isn't really so much the way it's done in Gulp, or the Gulpish way, if you like. I'm going to stick with that word, I quite like it. It's more common to see big tasks that do a lot of things rather than have lots of small tasks that all depend on each other. because the whole idea is you can run these tasks kind of at the same time as much as possible. So it's more common to see something like this. So this is my JS task. It loads in all the JavaScript files, concatenates them into concat.js. It then writes that concatenated file out into the dist directory. It then uses Gulp rename, which is another plugin, to rename the current file to app.min.js. It then pipes that through Uglify and then writes that into the dist directory as well. In Gulp, it's much more common to see these kind of big tasks rather than have this task depend on a previous one. And something interesting going on in the middle here as well. Notice this call to gulp.dest right in the middle of my plugin rather than, or my task rather than at the end. Gulp.dest will write the current files in the stream to disk, but it will then return the stream again. So you can write some files, some intermediate files if you like, to disk, and then continue working on that stream, which is precisely what I'm doing here. I'm concatenating all the files into one, I'm outputting that concatenated file, and I'm then renaming it and uglifying it, and then outputting it again. So you can kind of output different stages of files if that's something you need to do. And the reason that you don't typically have Gulp tasks depending on each other's quite so much is because this is just JavaScript. Right at the beginning, I showed you how to define a task and said you knew Gulp. That's because we're really just defining functions that can do absolutely anything. Most of them will use gulp.source and then pipe them through various plugins. Doesn't mean that they have to. Because this is just JavaScript, we can work with it just like we would any other JavaScript. We can abstract stuff into functions, for example. So here I've got two tasks that want to minify a bunch of files, but they want to minify different files. So I created a minify function, which takes in some files, it passes those through to gulp.source, pipes them through concat, and then uglify, and it returns that entire stream. Now in my JS task, I can give minify this star.js. That will pass it through into the minify function. It will call gulp.source with star.js. It's going to load up those files. It will concatenate them and uglify them. And then because it returns a stream, I can call .pipe on minify and just output it into the dist folder. And down here, when I want to minify some other files, I can use the minify function again and pipe that into a different place. So really in Gulp, you are just writing JavaScript, and you can apply exactly the same principles you would depending on, regardless of if you're writing Node.js or jQuery on the client or Angular or whatever it may be. You can abstract stuff into functions, create variables that store kind of common globs, for example, that you use a lot. It's really just JavaScript. And I know I'm going on about it, but I really want to get that point across because that was like the aha moment for me. A lot of people, when they first get into Gulp, look immediately for plugins to perform lots of things for them. But generally, actually, because you can use anything, you can use any package on NPM within a Gulp task because it's just JavaScript. It means often you don't need to use a Gulp plugin. You can just use a regular Node package within a task. Speaking of plugins, though, one of the ones that I find most useful, and I'm being a bit naughty because it's one I wrote, so I'm a little biased, is Gulp load plugins. Now, once you kind of expand your Gulp file, you're doing a bunch of things, you're probably going to end up with the top of the file looking something like this. Just hundreds and hundreds of these require statements. Maybe not hundreds, but definitely at least 5. And that's 5 too many. I mentioned I'm a really lazy developer. This is another reason. I want to install a plugin through NPM and then have it loaded in my JavaScript for me. I don't want to have to write one of these long lines that are, at least 50 characters? So I wrote a plugin. So it's on GitHub. Again, the links will be in the slides, which I'll share afterwards. It's called Gulp Load Plugins. And it reads plugins from your package.json and loads them in for you, effectively. So if in your package.json, you've got that dependencies object, and you've got GulpJS hint, Gulp concat, what you do in your Gulp file is you require Gulp. You have to always require Gulp. And then you create this variable, which I've called plugins. And what you do is you load in the Gulp load plugins plugin, and then with that second extra pair of parentheses, you immediately invoke it. So require Gulp load plugins is returning a function. Those extra brackets at the end are going to call that function straight away. What Gulp load plugins does is it goes through your package.json, it passes all those dependencies, it pulls out the ones that are Gulp plugins, and it will do the require for you. And what this means is you create this variable called plugins, and Gulp load plugins will then populate that plugins variable with all the plugins that it's required, that it's found from your package.json. Now that does mean when you use the plugins, you have to put plugins dot in front of them rather than just calling them directly, but it does save you having to manually require them. I've used plugins here as the variable name for clarity. I know a lot of people just use the $ to save them typing, and I'm all for that as well. I don't like typing. Another really useful thing that this plugin does is it lazy loads plugins. So once you get to the point where you're maybe loading in, at least 5 Gulp plugins, I've seen Gulp files with a lot more. When you then run any of the Gulp tasks, all those plugins have to be required at the top before anything else can happen. However, often you might run a Gulp task that only needs 1 or 2 of those plugins. It's very unlikely that one Gulp task will need all 10 of your plugins. So actually, loading in all 10 to only use 2 is really inefficient. And over bigger, more plugins, bigger Gulp files, that does it's a noticeable delay. So what Gulp load plugins does is it will only actually require the plugin when you use it. So effectively, the first time you refer to the plugin, it's then going to go and require it. It's effectively, it's like just in time. It will load in the plugin just before you need it. This really can have a noticeable speed increase over large Gulp files with a large amount of plugins. Cool. So that's Gulp today. Fairly soon will be Gulp 4, which is the next major release, and quite a lot is changing. I've basically taken this from the Medium post by Eric, the guy who created Gulp initially, and there's a link there if anyone wants to read in more detail. But the TLDR version is there's basically three big improvements. The first is that the task dependency system that Gulp uses which is actually called Orchestrator, I believe. It's what Gulp uses under the hood to define all its tasks. That's getting a complete rewrite to be able to deal with all your the concurrency or the series dependencies, all that kind of stuff much more easily and straightforward without you having to do all that manual legwork yourself. The API is going to be a bit cleaned up. In some places it's a little inconsistent. And probably one of the worst things about Gulp at the moment is its error handling is pretty bad. So if you have, say you have JS hint, which is a code quality checker running, and you're running that in a watch task, so every time you save a JavaScript file, JS hint reruns, which is a pretty good use of watch. If that JS hint errors because you've missed a semicolon, then Gulp will blow up and your watch task is stopped, which is pretty frustrating and not really what you want. You basically want to see the error and keep watch going. There are ways to hack around that at the moment. There are plugins that basically do the hack to get around that, but all that stuff is going to be moved into the core of Gulp. So Gulp 4 is going to be just basically taking all the really good stuff and just tidying up some of the rough edges. So I think this is probably the inevitable question that I'm going to anticipate early. So I really like both Grunt and Gulp. This time last year I was at this conference doing an introduction to Grunt talk. This time I'm here doing an introduction to Gulp. That doesn't mean that I've switched everything from Grunt to Gulp. It doesn't mean that I think Grunt is rubbish and Gulp is brilliant. They're both really, really good tools. I'm going to very much sit on the fence here. So I found, in my experience, Grunt, the barrier to entry is lower because you're just configuring these plugins and there are a lot more plugins. Gulp probably gives you more power in the long run. It lets you customize things a lot more. Because you are writing the actual code rather than configuring plugins, it's endless what you can achieve. In Gulp, if you don't like the Gulp Uglify plugin, the way it works, you could just use the Uglify package directly from NPM without going through Gulp and write your own abstraction on top of that. So you get a lot more control with Gulp. You have to do a bit more work in return. I'm not going to go into it today, but there is a slide deck floating around by Ben Allman, who created Grunt, talking about the plans for future versions of Grunt and how it's actually going to be able to load in Gulp plugins. I will try and find it and tweet it. It's really interesting. I recommend giving that a read if you're interested in the development of both Grunt and Gulp. But effectively, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't particularly matter which one you choose. As developers, we should be lazy, and we should try and automate these things. And if you use Grunt or Gulp or Rake or Make or any of the other tools, you're already doing better than most. You should actively look to lessen the friction between you and your processes. Your workflow should be as quick as possible. And it's really worth investing a little, not lots, but a good amount of time into these tools, because they really can, an hour setting up Gulp on Wednesday or Thursday morning will probably pay yourself back pretty quickly. What you need to do is you need to set up these tools, use them, reuse them, and come up with your template. You don't have to create these Gulp files from scratch every single time, because that would just be mad. You have to come up with one that you like, that has the set of plugins you like, and use that as your template. And over time, you can iterate on that slowly. You can add new plugins in. You can upgrade to the latest version of Gulp. You can do this or that. But you should have kind of a core set of plugins that you use. Because else, like me, you could spend days and days just tweaking your Gulp file and getting next to no work done. And it's also worth noting that I've really barely scratched the surface here of what Gulp and Grunt can offer. And in particular, Gulp, if you can think of it, there's probably a plugin out there for it already. Whoops. I looked earlier, and there were 779 Gulp plugins, which is actually pretty good. The Gulp, they're much stricter about making sure plugins maintain a certain set of conventions and standards. So for example, they always have to take in streams and spit out streams. And they're also really strict on making sure that a plugin that exists has to exist. So a good example of this is was the Gulp Browserify plugin. I don't know if anyone's used Browserify. It's effectively a tool that lets you use Node kind of modules in the browser. And what it does is it takes a bunch of files, it processes them, and it spits out a new bunch of files, or a new file, rather. And someone made a Gulp plugin to kind of abstract that. But it was actually rejected and deprecated and then eventually kicked off the API list, because all it really did was use the Browserify Node package, with very little on top of it. And that's kind of the whole ethos of Gulp, is if something doesn't need to be a plugin, it won't be, because you can just go and get the original package and give it your files. So with Gulp, you can look for a plugin, but if it's not there, there may well be a reason it's not there, and that reason could well be that you should just use the kind of original module rather than looking for the Gulp-specific plugin for it. Cool, I finished a little early. That's basically all I have. The best place to look is GulpJS.com. That's where you'll find all the documentation, links to GitHub, IRC, Twitter, other blog posts, etc., etc. The GitHub docs has a really good page called Gulp Recipes, which shows you some more advanced kind of things you can do with Gulp. For example, you can make tasks only run on files that have changed, rather than running blindly on all the files all the time, that kind of thing. So there's plenty of good stuff on there. There's also a milestone on GitHub for the Gulp 4 release. You can kind of have a look more at the issues they're working on and what they are going to change in a bit more detail if you're interested in that. I will be uploading these slides probably in about 15 minutes to SpeakerDeck. Well, I'm speakerdeck.com/JackFranklin. I'll also tweet them out too. So that's where you can find these slides with all the links in. And yeah, I think that's about me. That's me on Twitter. That's JavaScript Playground. I guess we have time for questions, because I've probably finished a bit early.
So first, let's put our hands together for Jack. That's actually a great talk.